Did you know that in 40 years, from 1981 to 2021, the Nigerian Naira that was once stronger than the US dollars has depreciated against the US dollars by 67,605%? Good evening. My name is romanoseghale. I'm an architect and also business and economic intelligence analyst. Today, we will be talking about the 2023 presidential elections, the economy, and the need for political ideology. In 2018, Mr. Bill Gates stated that Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo will account for 40% of the total number of people living in extreme poverty worldwide by 2050. I have argued that between 2018 and 2050, Nigeria will have 5 presidents. President Buhari will finish his tenure in 2023, and between 2023 and 2050 is 27 years. If everything goes well, 3 presidents will do 2 tenures each, which is 24 years, and the last president will be in his 3rd year in office. If you go by critical thinking, what Mr. Gates was basically telling us is that no matter who occupies Aso Rock, poverty will continue to increase. So it is not a person problem, but a system problem. Nigeria's economic model was not designed to create wealth. It is a system that impoverishes the people. That is why no matter who occupies Aso Rock come 2023, will not make a difference in changing the 2050 target unless the economic system is changed. We operate what I have come to term an asset depletion economy, where you deplete your asset to fund your expenditure without adequate reinvestment to create wealth to cover the liabilities of your asset depletion. Secondly, Nigeria is in what is called a poverty trap. And what is a poverty trap? A poverty trap is a mechanism which makes it difficult for people to escape poverty. A poverty trap is created when an economic system requires a significant amount of various forms of capital in order to earn enough to escape poverty. When individuals lack this capital, they may also find it difficult to acquire it, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of poverty. Because the Nigerian economic system reinforces a cycle of poverty, this is why it is easy to predict what will happen in 2050. By using data, this was why it was easy for Mr. Gates to tell us what will happen ahead of its time. This is why the 2023 election should not be about promises, but about political ideologies from the various political parties and what economic factors will be deployed to reverse the trend. It is also imperative to educate those who were born after the 80s, who never witnessed or experienced when $1 equaled 61 kobo. But now the same $1 equals 422 Naira officially, and as much as 680 Naira at the black market. For they are the highest number of voters, making up 55.45 million of the 96.3 million of registered voters as of July 31st, 2022. For your future is majorly the one at stake, and your generation have the numbers to swing the votes. So how did we get ourselves into this economic mess, and what is political ideology? But before we look into the definition and importance, let us first critically analyze the economy. And to do this, we'll have to go back to 1960 and critically analyze each year. So sit back and enjoy the analysis. It is packed full of empirical facts and data that will blow your minds away. Despite the discovery of crude oil in the 50s, in the 60s, agriculture contributed 54.7% to Nigeria's GDP and accounted for 75% of our total external earnings. It was mainly an agrarian economy. Crude oil was first discovered in Nigeria in 1956 at Oloibiri in the Niger Delta and was first exported in 1958 from the same Oloibiri oil fields. If you look at the GDP, despite the Nigerian Civil War of 1966 to 1970, the GDP only suffered a drop for 2 straight years, 1967 and 1968. By 1969, the GDP has surpassed the 1966 GDP. This is because Nigeria operated a productive economy, and in a productive economy, recessions don't last too long. In 1960, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, was formed, and price of crude oil was relatively stable, with an annual average price of $1.63 in 1960 and ending at an average of $1.27 in 1969. The trend you want to notice here is that despite the drop in the annual average crude price by 22.1% between 1960 and 1969, GDP increased by 58%. And despite the crude oil price, the civil war, and the increase in population, the GDP per capita increased from $93 in 1960 to $121.2 in 1969, an increase of 30.3%. In 1960, Nigeria's GDP was $4.2 billion and had reached $6.63 billion in 1969, but suffering a mild recession because of the Civil War and bouncing back in 1968. Between 1960 and 1969, the average GDP was $5.4 billion, meaning agriculture's average share of GDP was $2.95 billion. What you also notice here is that the Nigerian GDP grew at a steady rate and was sustainable due to productivity from agriculture. And it made up major parts of the GDP and accounted for major parts of our external earnings. By the 70s, the demand for crude oil by the industrialized world, coupled with instability in the Middle East, started driving up crude oil prices. In 1970, crude oil annual average price was $1.21. The Arab oil embargo, which was a retaliation for the United States' support of Israel in the Arab-Israeli War, also known as the Yom Kippur War of 1973, saw oil-producing Arab nations cut off crude export to the United States. And as a result, crude oil prices soared from the annual average of $2.07 in 1973 to $11 in 1974, an increase of 809% in 4 years. This was the period the sitting head of state made the famous statement that money was not our problem, but how to spend it. With the sudden surge in crude oil prices and the massive inflow of petrodollars, this signaled the beginning of Nigeria's economic woes and problems. Nigeria switched from a productive economy to what is called a rent-seeking economy. So what is rent-seeking? Rent-seeking is an economic concept that occurs when an entity seeks to gain added wealth without any reciprocal contribution of productivity. So what it basically means is that Nigeria is not doing anything productive, but just wait, and at the end of every month, rent from crude oil is paid into our foreign account and shared between the federal, state, and local governments. According to the World Bank, natural resources give rise to economic rents because they are not produced. Rents from non-renewable resources, fossil fuels and minerals, as well as rents from overharvesting of forests, indicate the liquidation of a country's capital stock. When countries use such rents to support current consumption, rather than to invest in new capital to replace what is being used up, they are in effect borrowing against their future. So according to the World Bank, what this means is that for those of us still living and the children yet unborn, the economic model has been borrowing and is still borrowing against our future. And this is one major reason the country has been caught up in the poverty trap. This is the economic model that has held Nigerians and Nigeria in perpetual poverty. While we think Nigeria is making money from selling crude oil, the country is actually getting poorer by mining and selling the crude oil. So after the 1973 oil embargo, and due to the demand of crude oil from the industrialized world and limited supply from the Arab world, crude prices remained relatively high till 1978. In 1979, oil prices would skyrocket again due to the Iranian Revolution, as the pro-Western Shah of Iran was deposed, the return of the Ayatollah Khomeini from exile, and the subsequent attack of the American embassy in Tehran, leading to the Iranian hostage crisis, where militants in Iran seized 66 American citizens and held 52 of them hostage for more than a year, an event which led to an international crisis, the defeat of President Jimmy Carter in 1980, and the subsequent election of President Ronald Reagan. The crisis cut off crude oil supply from Iran to the West, and as crude supply cut down from the Middle East, the West turned to countries like Nigeria to fill the gap. And by 1980, annual crude oil price had averaged $35.52 from just $1.21 in 1970, an increase of 2,836% in 11 years. Adjusted for inflation in 2012 and 2022 dollar terms, this will be an increase from $7.16 in 2012 to $126 in 2022, where the Naira is stronger than the dollar, coupled with low inflation of less than 70 million people. Now, this was the scenario in the 70s. Petrodollars flooded the economy, and Nigeria will abandon a productive economy of the 60s for a rent-seeking economy in the 70s. As can be seen from the graph, as far back as 1977, Nigeria had started recording trade deficits. So why did Nigeria start recording trade deficits? It is simple. With a strong currency that was stronger than the US dollars, high foreign reserve, and coupled with infrastructure deficit, it became cheaper to import than to manufacture. And this led to the gradual death of the manufacturing sector in Nigeria. Nigeria recorded a combined trade deficit of $3.55 billion between 1977 and 1978. But the currency remained relatively strong because of the 1979 and 1980 trade surplus. At the same time, GDP increased from $12.54 billion in 1970 to $164.48 billion in 1981. The effect from increasing crude oil prices of the 70s, an increase of 1,212%. Per capita income also increased from $224 in 1970 to $2,180 in 1981, an increase of 873%, placing Nigeria ahead of a lot of nations. But the sudden wealth increase was not from productivity. Hence, it was not sustainable. It was an economy where Nigeria allocates its oil wealth to foreign multinationals and wait for oil rents at the end of the month without any input of productivity. The trend you all want to see here is that each time the Nigerian economy was pushed to a new potential, it was as a result of wars or destabilization from crude oil producing countries and not from productivity or innovation. Hence, it was not sustainable. It is innovation that pushes every economy to a new potential and helps it remain sustainable. As Iran went to war with Iraq in 1980, and Iraq being another major supplier of crude oil, prices of crude oil reached an annual average of $35.52. With the United States over-dependence on crude oil because of industrialization and the direct correlation between price of crude oil and inflation, the Reagan administration moved in with tight monetary policy in an effort to fight mounting inflation, and this led to the 1980 United States recession. So what followed afterwards? The oil boom of the 70s came to an end. The United States went into recession, and between 1979 to 1981, oil consumption reduced in the industrialized world by 13%. OPEC was in crisis. The United States passed policies to start drilling oil and also cut down on importation of crude oil from 46.5% in 1977 to 28% in 1982, creating an oil glut. Please take note of everything I have said here as we're going to go back to it. So as you can see, the rent-seeking economy is a serendipity economy. What is serendipity? Serendipity is the occurrence and development of events by chance in a happy or beneficial way. And what is a serendipity economy? The serendipity economy suggests an economic model that is emergent and unpredictable, one that unfolds towards the future, not in a linear way, but rather through randomness and happenstance, which has been the scenario. Nigeria's economic model lacks a growth pattern, where growth happens only by chance and not through productivity. So what happened afterwards, and how did the events affect the Nigerian economy? Remember, in the 60s, crude oil prices dropped by 22.1% between 1960 and 1969. Despite the Civil War, GDP grew at the same period by 58% due to productivity. But in the 1980s scenario, the opposite will start happening. By 1982, the GDP started falling, and by 1983, it had fallen to $97 billion. It was estimated that about $16 billion was misappropriated by politicians between 1979 to 1983, prompting the military takeover in 1983. Having comfortably accepted the concept of a rent-seeking economy and abandoning a productive economy, by 1986, the GDP had fallen from 164.48 billion US dollars in 1981 to 54.81 billion US dollars. That is approximately 33.3%, or one-third of what the GDP was in 1981. As crude oil prices also fell from annual average of $35.52 in 1981 to $13.35 in 1986, a reduction of 62.4%. Remember, as GDP was reducing, population was increasing. Hence, Nigerians were now getting poorer in per capita income. From a population of 75.4 million people in 1981, population increased to 85.7 million in 1986, an increase of 10.3 million people, that is 13.66% in 5 years. And at the same time, GDP decreased from 164.48 billion US dollars in 1981 to 54.81 billion US dollars in 1986, a decrease of 66.7%. That is, the GDP lost 2/3 of its original value. By the end of 2021, Nigeria had an estimated 211 million people. Compared to countries like Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom, Nigeria had a lower population than these countries in 1960. United Kingdom added about 15 million people in 61 years. France added 21 million people. Germany, 10.3 million people. And Italy, about 9 million people. While Nigeria added about 166 million people in the same 61 years. Despite Nigeria's economic model, which does not create wealth, side by side, population growth and economic growth have a direct correlation with poverty. This was why China enacted the one-child policy to enable economic growth move faster than population growth, to enable them lift 800 million people out of extreme poverty. High population growth leads to deeper poverty, and deeper poverty contributes to high population growth. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, from the book, The End of Poverty, The Economic Possibilities of Our Time. By 1986, GDP per capita had reduced from $2,180 in 1981 to just $639 in 1986, a decrease of $1,541, losing approximately 71% of what it was in 1981. From 1981 to 1983, Nigeria recorded a total trade deficit of 13.96 billion US dollars, which led to the shortage of US dollars and the Naira losing its value against the US dollars and leading to inflation due to limited supply of dollars coming into the economy and coupled with high demand for importation. In 1972, a dollar exchanged for an average of 66 kobo. In 1980, it exchanged for an average of 55 kobo and 61 kobo in 1981. But as the economy took a nosedive, the Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, was introduced. The IMF called for the devaluation of the Naira, and by 1986, $1 was exchanging for 2 Naira, 2 kobo, which would lead to the beginning of massive inflation. Without productivity and operating a rent-seeking economy, the Nigerian economy continued on a free fall, reaching 44 billion in 1989 from $164.48 billion in 1981, just 26.7% of its 1981 value. In 1990, another global event will help push Nigeria's GDP to 54 billion US dollars, a GDP per capita of $567.5 and a 7.64 billion US dollars in trade surplus. In August 1990, in what would be termed the Gulf War, Iraq invaded Kuwait, disrupting global oil supply and sending the price of crude oil soaring to an annual average price of $22.26 per barrel. After a US-led military coalition succeeded in removing Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces from Kuwait in early 1991, the price fell to about $18.62 per barrel, average. The trend you want to see here is that each time the Nigerian economy was pushed to a new height, it was never from productivity, but rather happenstance from events of war or instability from other regions of the world, which in turn increases the price of crude oil. By 1991, exactly 10 years After oil pushed Nigeria to an unprecedented and unsustainable economic potential, the Naira had depreciated against the dollar from $1 to 61 kobo in 1981 to 9 Naira 91 kobo, leading to massive inflation, a depreciation of 1,525%. By 1993, the GDP of Nigeria's unproductive economy had fallen to an all-time low of 27.75 billion US dollar, what it was in 1975. That is 18 years earlier. With population at 102.7 million people, GDP per capita fell to $270, just a little higher than $252 what it was in 1973, 20 years earlier. Notice how Nigeria's unsustainable increasing population is also contributing to a reduction of GDP per capita. By 1998, crude price would fall to an annual average of $12 per barrel, its lowest in 20 years, creating a trade deficit of over $1 billion US dollars and affecting dollar price the following year. By year 2000, global economy was strengthening and OPEC was having more success at controlling production, and prices will increase to $27.6 annual average, what it was in 1985. Just like in the 70s, global events and wars will start to push up crude prices once again. By 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, and this will send oil prices up. By 2004, crude oil sold for an annual average of $36.05 annual average, the highest since 1960. The first time crude oil will hit that annual average price in 24 years, surpassing the average of 1981. By 2005, Nigeria's GDP for the first time in 24 years surpassed the 1981 GDP of 164.48 billion US dollars to reach 176.3 billion US dollars. By 2008, annual average price reached $94.01 as Venezuela cut off sales to ExxonMobil in a legal battle over nationalization of the company's properties. The war in Iraq still affected maximum output from the region. Labor strikes reduced production in Nigeria and the UK North Sea oil fields. Militants blew up oil facilities and pipelines in Nigeria. Mexico endured a severe decline in production from one of its major oil fields. This pushed Nigeria's GDP to $339.48 billion US dollars and GDP per capita to $2,259. The first time in 27 years, Nigeria's GDP per capita will surpass the GDP per capita of 1981. Nigerians were poorer for 27 years. What you also want to notice here is that the longer and higher the number of conflicts within a given period, the higher the price of crude oil. The same scenarios of the 70s was happening again in the 2000s. As petrodollars flooded the economy, Nigeria recorded a combined trade surplus of 109.46 billion US dollars between 2004 and 2008. This would lead to the price of dollars dropping from 133 Naira 15 kobo to 118 Naira 57 kobo as supply outpaced demand. Exactly what happened in the 70s was repeating itself again in the 2000s. By the second half of 2008, a deepening economic recession accompanied by severe financial crisis reduced oil prices in 2009 to an annual average of $60.86. As crude oil prices fell, Nigeria's GDP and GDP per capita also dropped to $295.01 billion US dollars and 1,911 US dollars. And by 2010, the demand from the West, India and China, and the uprising in the Arab world, which was later dubbed the Arab Spring, and the war in Libya would continue to push crude oil prices up, and prices will reach an all-time record annual average of $109.45 per barrel in 2012, and Nigeria's GDP reaching $455.5 billion US dollars and 508.69 billion US dollars in 2013. What was the effect of this? Petrodollars flooded the economy. The price of Naira to the dollar was stable. The higher the crude oil prices and the more barrels of crude oil Nigeria exports, the higher the trade surplus and the more stable the Naira is. Because as an import-dependent economy, the higher our trade surplus, the more dollar supply we have in the economy to meet the demand of importation. Despite annual average price of crude oil falling to $96.29 in 2014 and a trade deficit of 1.86 billion US dollars. The accumulated crude prices and trade surpluses help stabilize the Naira. Crude oil would push Nigeria to a new unsustainable potential with a GDP of 546.68 billion US dollars and the highest ever GDP per capita of $3,099. With no end to increasing crude cost and the quadrupling of oil prices between 2002 and 2012, the United States turns to mining shale oil through fracking technology, which had become more technologically advanced and less expensive to reduce importation of crude oil. The United States oil production output soared from 5 million barrels per day in 2008 to an average of more than 8.5 million barrels per day in 2014 and stood above 9 million barrels per day at the start of 2015, creating an oil glut. The oil boom of the 2000s came to an end, and Nigeria's economic woes will start all over again. Remember the events of 1982, where I said, please take note that we're going to come back to this. This is the same scenario repeating itself all over again. According to the World Bank, between mid-2014 and early 2016, the global economy faced one of the largest oil price declines in modern history. The 70% price drop during that period was one of the three biggest declines since World War II and the longest lasting since the supply-driven collapse of 1986. Booming U.S. shale oil production played a significant role in the oil price plunge from mid-2014 to early 2016. Efficiency gains in the sector lowered break-even price considerably, making U.S. shale oil the de facto marginal cost producer on the international oil market. Do you see the same pattern here? Exactly the same thing that happened in the 70s and how the oil boom ended in the 80s. The U.S. policy of drilling oil, the oil glut, the drop in crude oil prices, trade deficit, the Naira losing its value, and then inflation. One thing has continuously stood out from the analysis. No president, head of state, regime, or government in Nigeria since the 70s has performed in office outside the positive price of crude oil. It has been the common denominator for all successful governments in Nigeria, and the price has always been determined by conflict, wars, and events in other regions of the world. Innovation is what pushes an economy to a new potential and helps it remain sustainable. No government in Nigeria has ever attained a new potential in the economy, either through innovation of a new product or productivity, but only through oil prices. Nigeria has recorded a total combined trade deficit of 102.13 billion US dollars between 2014 to 2020, a straight 7-year trade deficit. While official figures in US dollars for 2021 by the World Bank is not out, but according to Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, total merchandise trade deficit for the year 2021 stood at 1.94 trillion naira. This is the reason why the Naira is on a free fall. Export is what supplies the dollars for the economy. If Nigeria was productive, we would not have much pressure of importations. Countries are no longer buying as much crude as they used to buy. From about 2.2 million barrels per day, Nigeria's output is now about 1.1 million barrels per day, 50% of its original output. Crude oil makes up about 90% of our external earnings, unlike when agriculture made up 75% of our external earnings. For example, export to the United States in 2008 was about 35 billion US dollars. As at 2019, it was just a mere 2.82 billion US dollars, less than 10% of what it sold in 2008. Export to the United Kingdom in 2012 was about 9 billion US dollars. As at 2019, it was just 1.16 billion. That is about 13% of the trade in 2012. The list is the same with most major trading countries. In 2020, there were about 250 million passenger cars registered in the European Union. The EU says there will be no more fossil fuel cars on European roads by 2035. That is just 13 years away. With crude oil accounting for over 90% of our external earnings, You know what that means for the economy. Nigeria has had 8 straight years of trade deficit in a non-productive economy. The tsunami will not stop unless Nigeria changes its economic model to a production and investment economy. So now let us go back to Mr. Gates' statement that Nigeria and the DRC, that is the Democratic Republic of Congo, will account for 40% of the total number of people living in extreme poverty by 2050. If you calculate the estimated GDP compounded growth rates of Nigeria from now to 2050, the estimated population in 2050, inflation growth rate, and the asset depletion economic model, you will realize that Mr. Gates is right. If you look at data, Nigerians were richer in 1981 with a per capita income of $2,180 than they were in 2021 with a per capita income of $2,085. That means 40 years after, Nigerians are poorer. Unless Nigeria changes its economic model, then Mr. Gates' prediction will come to pass. So what are the consequences of a rent-seeking economy? According to research, the following have been proven. 1. Reduced economic efficiency through misallocation of resources. 2. Reduced wealth creation. 3. Lost government revenue. 4. Heightened income inequality. And 5. Potential national decline. We will take each one and explain. 1. Reduced economic efficiency through misallocation of resources. The federal government collects oil rents from the multinationals and allocates the funds to federal, states, and local governments, which are used for recurrent expenditures rather than for investment in human capital development and critical infrastructures, which are efficiency drivers and investments in the economy. Because of this, the federal and state government lack incentive to work to grow the economy to generate funds. Today, most are burdened with debt that the next generation may not be able to pay back. And because the economy depends on crude oil rents, unemployment and underemployment are always high when there is a crash in prices of crude oil. Today, unemployment is at 33.3% and underemployment at 22.9%. 2. Reduced wealth creation. Because of the high rate of unemployment and underemployment, the average Nigerian finds it difficult to invest in asset classes to create and grow wealth. Secondly, because of the lack of investment in critical infrastructure and education, it is difficult to create wealth. A typical example is the payment of school fees. After the payments, the average Nigerian barely has anything left to invest to create wealth. With consumer spending making up 2/3 of the economy, the middle class, which is supposed to be the highest spender in the economy, is being wiped out. Consumer spending is affected and the economy cannot expand the way it should. 3. Lost government revenues. Because government sits back to collect oil revenue monthly without productivity, there is no incentive to invest and drive tax revenue. Today, Nigeria has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. As at 2019, it was 6%, reaching 8% in 2021. What you need to notice here is that Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo are always at the bottom of the ladder. Both practice the same economic model and are projected to account for 40% of world population that will live in extreme poverty by 2050. Secondly, since there is reduced wealth creation, it becomes almost impossible for people to pay tax. 4. Heightened income inequality. Again, today Nigeria has one of the highest number of people living in extreme poverty in the world. What you need to observe here is that India is reducing extreme poverty and will meet the 2030 deadline of the SDGs to eradicate extreme poverty worldwide. Nigeria and most of the rest of the mineral resource and rent-seeking economies like the DRC, Angola, and Republic of Congo are in the red and yellow because they are either adding to extreme poverty or will not meet the 2030 deadline. Today, 69.9 million Nigerians live in extreme poverty, representing 32% of the population, while 68.2 million people from the Democratic Republic of Congo live in extreme poverty, representing 73% of the population. 5. Potential national decline. The Naira has depreciated 67,605% against the US dollars between 1981 and 2021, a currency it was once stronger than. Today, there are an estimated 260 million kids outside school in the world, of which Nigeria has an estimated 18.5 million. Banditry and kidnapping has now become the order of the day. Crude oil and other mineral resource theft are ongoing on a regular basis. Mass exodus and brain drain, security challenges around the country. When you look at the corruption index, education index, health index, security index, and other indexes, Nigeria is always at the bottom of the ladder. So now, we would look at political ideology and why does it matter. A political ideology is a set of related beliefs about political theories and policies held by an individual, group of individuals, or a particular social class. This set of beliefs form the basis of how an individual, a group, or a social class views the world and the proper role of the government. These beliefs claim a monopoly of truth and therefore forward action plans on how to create a society that reflects the needs and wants of its citizens. So why is political ideology important? Ideology sets a direction for a nation to develop by helping in setting national goals and guidelines for the achievement of these goals. Without ideology, a nation will be directionless or without a vision and destination to pursue. Why is it important for the people to study the political ideologies of various political parties? Ideologies are important because they shape how we perceive and interact with the world. In politics, they affect the voting choices we make and the policies we support. For instance, I will use the United States of America as an example. The Republicans and Democrats have their different political ideologies. These political ideologies help the parties formulate their policies and laws when in power. Examples include LGBT and gay rights, abortion, immigration, and the free market economy. While both the Republicans and Democrats believe in a free market economy and laissez-faire, which is a policy of minimum governmental interference in the economic affairs of individuals and society, both parties differ on fiscal policy on how to raise taxes to achieve fiscal expenditure. The Republicans believe that higher taxes on the rich discourage economic activities. They believe that lower taxes on the rich is the most important single determinant of economic growth. This is because when the rich make money, they invest rather than spend. If you give the rich $100, he will invest $90 and spend only about $10 on himself. They believe that this creates the trickle-down effect, where more companies are created, it creates more economic activities and impact, more people are employed, unemployment will fall, unemployment benefits will fall, and government can tax those employed to cover up. They believe that if you create and increase taxes on the rich, they will move their money and companies to countries with tax havens or where there are lower taxes, leading to job losses, lower economic activities, higher unemployment benefits from the government, and eventually loss of taxes. On the other hand, the Democrats believe that government should tax the rich more and reduce taxes on the middle class and the poor. Why? Their ideology comes from the fact that the middle class is the greatest spender in the economy. They don't save that much. If you give a middle class $100, he will spend $90 and probably only invest $10 on himself. And of the 5 factors that make up the GDP, consumer spending, government spending, investment, import and export, consumer spending makes up 2/3 of the economy. That is 66.6%. So they believe to expand the economy, you target the middle class by lowering taxes on them so that they can spend more. Both parties trying to achieve economic growth but with different ideologies. This is why you constantly hear people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, both Democrats, always advocating that the rich should pay their fair share of taxes. So let the political parties and candidates come out and tell Nigerians, and Nigerians should also demand what their political ideologies are and what economic factors they will use to stabilize the Naira and grow the economy. The trade deficits of 2014 to 2021, which have not stopped, have created a tsunami, and the aftershocks will be devastating. According to Ronald Reagan, the 40th president of the United States, he said, and I quote, "Inflation is as violent as a mugger, as frightening as an armed robber, and as deadly as a hitman." End of quote. Inflation robs you of your wealth. With the continuous trade deficit, if government does not close it, the government will eventually run out of money and it will be a major catastrophe. This is one major reason borrowings have consistently increased over time. The Naira will continue on its free fall unless Nigeria moves away from a rent-seeking economy and become productive. Remember, the population is now about 3 times what we had in 1981. We've had 8 straight years of trade deficit compared to the early 80s. Diaspora remittance has been the major factor helping stabilize and keeping the Naira from plummeting beyond its current value to over 1,000 Naira to a dollar. With a trade deficit of over 106 billion US dollars from 2014 to 2021, diaspora remittance between year 2000 and 2021 was 343.85 billion US dollars. And from 2014 to 2021 alone, diaspora remittance has equaled 167.9 billion, helping cover the shortfall in trade deficit and supply of dollars in the economy. There's a comprehensive report of this analysis. If you need one, you can send me a direct message on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. My name, again, is Romanoseghale. Thank you, and may God bless Nigeria.